Testing. is a dominating condition of this mode of production. In critical moments, profit too confronts the capitalist as fact, as a condition of production, since he curtails or stops production. When profit disappears or is reduced to a marked degree as a result of fallen prices. Hence, the nonsensical pronouncements of those who consider the different forms of surplus value to be merely forms of distribution, they are just as much forms of production, close quote. The crucial point here being that in the consciousness and standpoint of the capitalist, everything happens above board, and at the same time it does not. That's Adorno's point of view. To the functioning capitalist, surplus value in the form of interest appears as a cost of production, since he has borrowed the money or the value advance with which production began. At the same time, however, the functioning capitalist is unaware of how this surplus pays not only interest and rent, but even his own profit. This is a controversial point. He is unable to see how interest and rent become the conditions of wage labor, which again yields the surplus from which his profit, interest, and rent is formed. The only thing that interests the capitalist are his cost of production and his profit. What happens in between, that is the origin of both his costs and his profits, is anathematic. Interest-bearing capital for Marx, conceived of without the mediation of either production process or circulation process, is the consummate automatic fetish, the self-valorizing value, the money-making money, and in this form it no longer bears any trace of its origin. But it is precisely this phenomenal state that crucially informs bourgeois political economy's scientific evaluation, and here is also the source of the sticking fast to the apparent forms that give rise to the fetishism of, for example, profit, interest, and rent and capital, and not labor as fruit-bearing. For Marx, therefore, the categories of bourgeois economics consist precisely in forms of this kind. The above passage, however, also serves as a striking example that for Marx, fetishism is not a problem of a subjectively wrong or illusionary perception of reality. What Marx also calls objective forms of thought, and what Hegel has termed objective thought, objektiver Gedanke, are socially valid and hence objective phenomena. For both Marx and Hegel, objective forms of thought are the result of a process in which subjective consciousness becomes sublated, which, to speak with Marx, gain an objectivity that becomes independent of the will, foreknowledge, and actions of individuals. As Ingo Elba contends, objective forms of thought for Marx are neither value nor money as economic forms, but the reproduction in thought of these forms in their ready-made form of appearance, in which they no longer exhibit the social mediation of their own genesis. Yet, the category of abstract labor that constitutes the buried essence of capitalist self-representation cannot be empirically verified or falsified, that is, verified/falsified. Its self-representation can only ever appear in fetishistic form as money, profit, interest, etc., fostering its various fetishisms. Let me break here for a second and, plastic, right? I give you one word, plastic. Yeah. It has no other mode of existence. It is therefore only by the methodological Turing, Turing, bomb of political economy, the labor theory of value as the logic of the substance, the measure and the form of the capitalist metabolism. This is a lot of stuff here. That a common grounding nexus of the disparate forms that value assumes in its actual existence as money, price, profit, interest, rent, etc., can be meaningfully decoded and thus generated. To explain why we believe this faculty allows the labor theory of value to link Marx's critical method with its object, we shall briefly refer to the problematic of essence and appearance and the notion of form, and especially the form of labor. As mentioned earlier, the question of essence or substance and appearance or form is a recurring theme in Marx's critique and serves as a fruitful heuristic in light of the role of the labor theory of value for the critique of fetishism, i.e., the critique of the fetish character value assumes as form. The critique, i.e., the critique of the fetish character value assumes as form. Period. Again, it is important to be aware of the notion of form as fetish, for it marks the discursive sphere in which Marx's critique is embedded. In this sense, in his important work on Marx's critique of fetishism, Stefan Grigat points out, Grigat, points out that the secret of the fetish consists not so much in the quantitative expression of value in labor time as the measurement of the magnitude of value, its substance, as Orthodox Marxism would have us believe, but rather in the qualitative form of capitalist labor itself. This is an important moment here. Now, what would the qualitative, let me break here and ask, what would the qualitative form of capitalist labor look like or be? Indeed, Heinrich has emphasized with regard to the transformation problem that the central problem of Marx's value theory, namely how it is possible in the first place to relate products of labor to one another as commodities, has been neglected in theories of value, to which recur to the labor theory of value as a quantitative model for determining price, instead of emphasizing the qualitative form of the specific kind of labor which is productive of value, that is, abstract labor. This is an interesting problem of, kinds of measurement. Let me get back to this. While we agree with these authors that the labor theory of value is not exhausted in determining the magnitude of value, we think that the relevance of Marx's value theory consists first and foremost in delivering the critique of the forms that value assumes in bourgeois productive relations. That is, with higher productive relations, abstract labor becomes increasingly obscure as the fetishistic forms of value proceed to abstract from the process of production. What therefore remains hidden is the form of labor under capitalist production, and this second meaning of form plays yet another significant role for Marx's critique, famously in his direct reckoning with Smith and Ricardo's negligence of the form of value, which in fact turns value into exchange value, i.e., the social form of exchange value positing labor. With regard to these two equally important and yet distinct specific usages of form in Marx's critique, Helmut Brentel, we're back again, has developed the heuristic of social form 1 and social form 2. Now, let me break here for a second and note that social form 1 and social form 2 in some ways has a structural resemblance, a family resemblance, as it were, to differential rents 1 and 2. But anyway, that's for other work. It is crucial to comprehend that Marx views both value and value form as specifically social forms of social labor, social forms of social labor. Abstract general labor as the substance of value already presents a specifically social form, form 1, which assumes its form of appearance and existence in the categories of bourgeois economy. Form 2, social form, assumes a form and existence in categories of bourgeois economy. Form 2. In other words, close quote, in other words, these two concepts of form, which equally informed Marx's critical method, are related. In form 1, the social form of labor that is exchange value positing or abstract labor presents the hidden matrix or the Turing bomb to Form 2, which designates the autonomization from the conscious standpoint of the economic agents. Paradigmatically, as the autonomization from use value in the value form of money. So let me break here and say this is an important description of a process that we have often not described adequately, let's put it that way, in terms of the relation from or the relation between exchange and use values. And I think what we have here is a way of describing the abstractness of abstract labor. Anyway, the form of, back to the text, the form of social labor in capitalism, Form 1 for Marx, is therefore to be found in the concept of abstract labor at the beginning of his exposition, which passes through, to use an emblematic expression by Uno, tosu, or tosu, the forms of appearance which the value forms, Form 2, assume. Needless to say, the labor theory of value, which defines abstract labor as this commonality, as substance, can only reach its full exposition, and with it, its full confirmability at the end of the exposition, when all the categories of political economy will have been analyzed. It therefore anticipates a methodological future tense that we have elsewhere named the pudding, whose proof is in eating it, i.e. in applying the model of labor as social form as the interpretive framework. Yet, this is precisely the analytical and anti-dogmatic strength of Marxist labor theory of value. For the crucial insight and the presupposition of the labor theory of value lies in the method of its proof, i.e. in the very process of the critical analysis of the categories and contentions of political economy. That is, in eating the pudding. Hence, the proof of the pudding, the labor theory of value, is in eating it, reviewing the contentions, convulsions, and conventions of the theoretical interpreters of the bourgeois relations of production, that is, the political economists, at every level of the unfolding of their categories. The fact that it cannot be proven without the process of its own implementation that must pass through the totality of capitalist social relations and their conventional interpretation is, however, what endows it with its anti-positivistic and anti-dogmatic character. We can therefore conclude that for Marxist labor theory of value as the critical method of the defetishization or demystification of the categories of classical political economy, the standpoint of totality is already presupposed. And by being presupposed in every categorical instance shown to be semantically and pragmatically in effect, that is, in that sense, for example, the concept of money in the very first chapter of Capital already presupposes the concept of wage labor and capital. This view, the presupposition of the concept of wage labor and capital, this view stands in stark contrast with Uno's understanding of the labor theory of value as an unnecessary presupposition which cannot be proven at the locus of its presentation in the first chapter of the book Capital. Let me break here and start that there is a conflict between static and dynamic in this particular kind of context, which is, of course, one of the general problems of static analysis, etc. Because Marx's presentation of the labor theory of value in the first chapter of the book Capital, as will be prominently discussed, arguably presents the strongest bone of contention for Uno. We shall give a brief account to a theme directly related to the question of method and object. The question, with what must science begin? The question of presupposition. Now, an introduction, 1.1.3, introduction to the problem of presupposition. For Uno, the definition of the substance of value as abstract labor and its quantity as socially necessary labor time in the average is introduced prematurely into the architecture of Capital, the book. Marx should have instead deferred it to the analysis of the section, the labor process and the valorization process proper in chapter 7. At the beginning, Uno contends Marx should have focused on the form of value in exchange alone. In his own principles, Uno, the principles of political economy, Uno, hence, presents what he considers to be a significant corrective to Marx by deferring the labor theory of value to the quote-unquote doctrine of production, which is, however, preceded by the doctrine of circulation. Now, a detailed analysis of Uno's restructuring of capital and its motivations will be conducted in Chapter 4. Talk about presuppositions. We believe, however, that Uno does not realize how mistaken his criticism is. To introduce the matter, which we will return to, we shall draw attention to the specific critical claim that the alleged unproven presupposition of the labor theory of value has in the context of Marx's method. Let it be recalled that Marx's exposition is directly informed by the critique of fetishism. What Marx identified as the object of the analysis, that is, the capitalist mode of production and its bourgeois interpretation, is implicitly presupposed at the beginning, even if not all of the concepts that we need to characterize it can be made explicit. The explicit or the semantic, this is actually an interesting sentence, the explicit or the semantic, i.e. the meaning of a concept, such as capitalist mode of production, is postponed until the implicit or the pragmatic can be fully thematized. So this is, let me break here and say, well, is this praxis? Anyway, back to the text. This is quite uncontroversial. Definition of certain concepts, say city or apple or consciousness, presuppose a certain conceptual and logical apparatus other than the concepts to be defined. This, let me break here and say, well, is this about a kind of critical realist approach? In his study of Hegel's dialectic, Dieter von Schneider calls the problem of the exposition the semantic pragmatic discrepancy. Quote, for a theory of dialectic, two aspects seem to be of fundamental significance. On the one hand, the view according to which every logical category, with the exception of the final determination, contains a semantic-pragmatic discrepancy. It consists of the fact that the explicit meaning of a category does not express all that is implicitly presupposed for its meaning. That this must be the case immediately makes sense, since in order to explicate a particular meaning, the whole apparatus of logical categories and principles must be presupposed. This is foreground, background, maybe. This tension between the semantic content and that which is pragmatically presupposed for the argumentative acts that precede it necessitates the introduction of categories by which this pragmatic surplus meaning is further semantically explicated and diminished. That's the author's note about the diminished. In other words, the semantic pragmatic discrepancy contained in a category which, under specific conditions, can be exacerbated to a performative contradiction. Long calls this being is not nothingness. Makes the necessity to introduce ever new categories plausible as long as the pragmatic surplus meaning remains. So pragmatic surplus meaning, there's all kinds of stuff there. Close quote. In Marx's exposition, the matter is quite simple. The postponement of the explicit meaning of the category is, however, successively closed in on by the performance of the actual analysis. This is the praxeological element. The pragmatic surplus meaning, the baggage carried by the labor theory of value, and the concept of abstract labor as the substance of value throughout the analysis is thus successively shed. This is the shedding of pragmatic surplus meaning, with an ever deeper insight into the process of exchange between commodity A, 20 yards of linen, and commodity B, 1 coat. The appearance of simple exchange as the predominant social metabolism loses its heuristic power. This is important. Let me break here and say this is an important methodological issue that needs to be further pursued. Quote, it becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their values, but rather the reverse. The magnitude of the value of commodities which regulates the proportion in which they exchange. So we're looking at a kind of inversion here. This is footnote 103. The cognitive gain for Marx hence consists precisely in the emphasis on the presupposed context of totality in which isolated, that is, autonomous concepts lose their explanatory power. The obvious explanation in the category of exchange value does not categorically redeem the complex relations which generalized commodity exchange entails. For Marx, therefore, the whole system of bourgeois production is presupposed so that a category like exchange value can appear on its surface. But let me break here for a second and say and note that, this is what critique is. Anyway, quote, an analysis of the specific form of the division of labor, the conditions of production on which it's based, and the economic relationships of the members of society to which these conditions of production are reduced would show that the whole system of bourgeois production is the premise for exchange value appearing on its surface as a mere point of departure in the process of exchange, as it unfolds in the simple circulation as a social exchange of matter, simple but encompassing both the whole of production and the whole of consumption. This is the bridge between Department 1 and Department 2. It would transpire, therefore, that already other, more complicated relations of production, more or less conflicting with the liberty and dependence of individuals, their economic relationships, are the premise that as free private producers in simple relations of purchase and sale, they should confront each other in the process of circulation and should figure as its independent subjects. But from the standpoint of the simple circulation, these relationships are obliterated. Where have we heard that before? Yet, Marx deliberately chooses to present the analysis of the value form in the quote-unquote language of English economists. And here is where Marx's method of the semantic pragmatic cleft and his critique of fetishism comes full circle. For it's precisely this quote-unquote appearance on the surface which forms the standpoint of classical and neoclassical political economy that forms the target of his critique. We can say that Marx's target is doubled in our critical evaluation of Unno's intervention, which, as we will show, shares its methodological impetus with classical and neoclassical political economy, classical political economy, and neoclassical political economy. Marx's method of form analysis thus consciously takes its vantage point from the simple categories of bourgeois political economy, that is, the commodity, exchange value, exchange at all. However, not to adapt its propositions unquestioned, but to analyze these forms toward their form determinations, towards the characteristic that point beyond their reductionisms. This is a dynamic analysis, right? All right, back to the text. For Marx, the analysis of the economic law of motion of modern society is thus not a matter of providing definitions. It is much rather a matter of reconstructing the object through its critique, a quote-unquote forensic investigation into the forgotten, obscured, and obfuscated implications of his very object, implications that make up the pragmatic surplus meaning. We're going to come back to this, PSM, and therefore cannot be made explicit at the beginning, but which nevertheless constitute the object of the analysis. It's a work in process, right? The capitalist mode of production and the social form of labor that characterizes it can only be made explicit by the successive analysis of the fetishized categories that constitute the categories of conventional political economy and its science, period. Herein lies the critical claim of Marx's method. We will show that Marx, in his exposition of the object of his study, and much ignored by Unno and his followers, very deliberately steps into the pragmatic semantic discrepancy, the PSD, pragmatic semantic discrepancy that is required at the beginning of any critical study of a system, especially a dynamic one such as capitalism. See, there's a Grundrisse lurking somewhere, right? In other words, we hold that for Marx, the proof of the labor theory of value is in eating the pudding, i.e., in performing the critique of political economy. With this radically new insight into the problematic of the categorical analysis of the capitalist mode of production, putting the critique of fetishism at the heart of Marx's intervention, a new discipline is born. That of the categorical criticism of the real appearance, the Realerschein of the social relations of production. To therefore understand how the new object of investigation, an object that simultaneously informs the method of Marx's analysis, emerged, we should take a look at the theoretical formation of theories of value in Marx's predecessor, notably Adam Smith and David Ricardo. It would also certainly be rewarding to draw a different line of trajectory from Proudhon to Marx. Let me break here for a second, and but perhaps it's even, you got to look at Bailey and Mill and a whole bunch of other folks. But anyway, that's another story. Back to the text. But this line, which would without doubt contribute to understand Marx's negation of Proudhon's equation of value, recall that, and immediate labor time would undermine the crucial point in Marx, namely that the mature Marx was less interested in contrasting the capitalist mode of production with the utopias of socialism. This is that break with Proudhon, right? But in contrasting, Marx was more interested in contrasting the bourgeois mode of production with its own claims. So it's an autocritique if we borrow some other language from other places. To better pinpoint Marx's theoretical formation of the new object of political economy, encompassing the critique of all previous economic science, we therefore should remain with the bourgeois economists Smith and Ricardo. As mentioned earlier, Marx's labor theory of value is to be understood as the methodological heuristic for the analysis of Marx's central question. Why and how do all products of labor assume the fetishistic form of value under the conditions of the capitalist mode of production? That is, forms that constitute the categories of political economy. Now, to answer this question, Marx was specifically intent to recapitulate the process of the constitution of the very objects of classical political economy themselves. So, what we're examining here is, of course, something that's been done by other people like Shake. We're re-examining some of the premises or presuppositions of classical political economy. In the next chapter, we shall therefore recapitulate the value theories of Smith and Ricardo to understand how Marx's own theory was developed from their critique. That's why we're going to go back to Shake in a bit, to Anwar Shake's work. 1.2, the aporias, the gaps of classical political economy. Marx to Engels, 1867. The best points of my book are: 1, it is fundamental to all understanding of the FACTS, facts, the twofold character of labor according to which it is expressed in use value or exchange value, which is brought out in the very first chapter. Number 2, the treatment of surplus value, regardless of its particular forms as profit, interest, ground rent, etc. The treatment of the particular forms in classical political economy, where they are forever being jumbled up together with the general form, is an olla patrida. Marx's radical break with, close quote, Marx's radical break with the science of political economy consists in laying the foundation for a specific new object of investigation under the capitalist mode of production, that is, the social form of labor. His theory is therefore not merely an extension or a rearrangement of the economic theory of the classics, but the invention of a completely new horizon, like a new interpretation, new horizon for the critical analysis of the capitalist mode of production. Marx's own self-understanding of his intervention as the critique of political economy is where his radical revolution, indeed, his communist Copernican turn, is embedded. There's a lot going on there. As mentioned before, Marx's project therefore cannot be understood in abstraction from his critique of the classics. It is Marx's reading of political economists, notably Smith and Ricardo, and vulgar economists, say Bailey, Malthus, James Mill, McCulloch, DeStroot, de Tracy, and many others, but also socialists like Proudhon, Owen, and others, that formed the condition of possibility for his own theoretical development that resulted in his magnum opus, the book Capital. Understanding the social form of labor is precisely what Marx found wanting in conventional political economy. Quote, political economy has indeed analyzed value and its magnitude, however, incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within these forms. But it has never once asked the question why the content has assumed that particular form, that is to say, why labor is expressed in value and why the measurement of labor by its duration, time, is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. Classical political economy, in fact, nowhere distinguishes explicitly and with clear awareness between labor as it appears in the value of a product and the same labor as it appears in the product's use value. Close quote. Now, what Marx critically discerns as the specific lack in the theories of the classics is the problem of the fetishism of the bourgeois relations of production, a problem not even fathomed to exist before Marx's mature critique. The distinction between abstract and concrete labor is the crucial, critical distinction to clear the path to a thoroughgoing critique of the capitalist relations of production and its inverted self-representations. By determining the social form of labor under these relations as value-producing, value-producing, abstract-general, human labor, and distinguishing it from concrete labor as manifested in the commodity's use value, he also pierced the problem of form and content, the problem of fetishism. Now, let me break here for a second and remind ourselves about general intellect and a bunch of other things. So there's stuff going on here that's important. And the more interesting problem is, continuing the break, is that, how does fetishism resolve issues of general intellect? Can it? Let's put it that way. The specificity of abstract labor as the substance of value for Marx consists in the fact that it always appears in a specific form, namely the value forms of the commodity: money, capital, wage, profit, price, interest, and rent. Categories that comprise the science of political economy, in which it is always systematically obfuscated. Yet it is precisely this phenomenological state of things. It is precisely this phenomenological state of things that the essence or substance itself cannot appear but in an inverted, distorting, and altogether spurious form. It goes unnoticed in the elaborations of classical political economy, not to speak of neoclassical theories after the demise of the Ricardian school. In other words, before Marx, the science of political economy was solely concerned with the forms of value as value's mere appearance, without giving a thought to the specific substance, i.e., the general social form of labor, that give rise to these categories at all. Indeed, without giving any thought to the epistemological cleft between the appearance and the essence of specific value forms at all, the classics had to remain on a level of abstraction that has to tautologically resort to explaining form by form itself. So you can see here lurking beneath the epistemological gap question, maybe. As noted earlier, the question of form in Marx can only be answered on the basis of its analysis as the method of form analysis. Marx's method of form analysis dissolves the fetishized objective dimension of a category like exchange value or the commodity as only appearing to be simple, given, and indeed presuppositionless. The analysis of their form shows that they can be fully grasped only as the result of a very specific social process, presupposing both the relations of reproduction and class. The beginning of Marx's analysis in Capital is therefore already an ideological critique in the strict sense, as a critique of the self-representations and delegitimizations of the sphere of simple circulation that constitutes the only object of bourgeois economy and its science. Through a reconstruction of Smith and Ricardo's theory of value in this chapter 1.2, we will see how Marx developed his own critical theory of value. Not unlike the classical and vulgar political economists Marx attacked, many present-day Marxian theorists, however, reinitialize and repeat the tautological convolutions of Marx's predecessors. In the last section of chapter 1, we will therefore argue that under the heading of value form theory, Marxian scholars of the last decades have initiated an apotheosis of form while conferring a much lesser status to substance or content, an intervention that is not only quite contrary to Marx's critical intention, but regresses to the fetishisms of the bourgeois relations of production that Marx was precisely out to deconstruct. And you can see, let me break here, and this is a critique of, perhaps the Frankfurt School, whatever. To first understand how the new object and method of investigation emerged in Marx, we should first take a look at the theoretical formation of theories of value in Marx's predecessors, notably Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The aporias at work, the lacunae, the aporias at work in these theories considerably informed Marx's critique of them and gave rise to Marx's own theory, labor theory of value. So 1.2.1, Smith and Ricardo's aporia and the birth of Marx's value theory as critique. Of all the classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, along with William Petty and Benjamin Franklin, were the most revered, but also the ones most elaborately criticized by Marx. The praise they received was owed to their attempts to systematically link an albeit vague concept of value to an equally vague concept of labor. The criticism was owed to their respective failures to be consistent in doing so. This, for Marx, was not a mystery, but was accounted for by Smith's and Ricardo's bourgeois consciousness, which is oblivious to the analysis of the social form of labor, predominantly in the form of money and capital, i.e., the form of appropriation of alien labor without an equivalent that is obfuscated in these forms. In fact, as we will see, because of their failure to consequently establish the link between a social form of wealth and the labor that produces it, neither Smith nor Ricardo can be said to have any labor theory of value at all. Now, this is especially true for Ricardo, who never proposed an embodied labor, right? Remember, congealed, or substantialist theory of value, but was interested solely in cost and production prices, in Marx's terminology, from the outset of his theory. Ricardo's investigation, hence, only revolved around magnitudes of relative values. In their respective theories of value, therefore, precisely because they disengaged their discussions from a coherent and unified ground of value in social labor, they resorted to aporia, exemplified in their tautologies to explain labor values through the value of labor, with Adam Smith, or in their circular production, price-determined understanding of value, Ricardo. This is, remember, neo-Ricardianism, which effectively led to the collapse of a meaningful link between value and the labor that produces it. Their endeavors finally resorted to explaining the economic form of capitalism based on the theoretical framework of the circulation, not the production sphere, right? This is that, right? The problems of Department 1 versus Department 2 yet again. Back to the text. What is more, the claim that Marx's labor theory of value is merely to be regarded as a classical residue in Marx's value theory, a myth that haunts Marxological debates even today, must be abandoned. Not only on the basis that Marx's theory was social and historically specific, while Smith's and Ricardo's were not, but on the basis that Smith and Ricardo, in contrast to Marx, ultimately did not hold a labor theory of value at all. Period. The same is true for Marx's concept of abstract labor as the particular form which labor assumes as the substance of value, something of which the classics had no notion. Let me break here and say, this is because of the Hegelian stuff, remember. Hence, authors that claim Marx's concept of the substance of value in abstract labor or the labor theory of value were altogether derived. This is Gert Ruten's point of view. Remember, we were looking at Gert Ruten before a couple of days ago. From classical political economy are shown to be wrong. Hence, let me repeat, hence, authors that claim Marx's concept of the substance of value in abstract labor or the labor theory of value were altogether derived from classical political economy are shown to be wrong. This is all the more the case as curiously, none of these interpreters engages with the classics at all, which makes the thesis of the classical residue even stranger and more inappropriate. The next section will briefly demonstrate Smith's and Ricardo's circle of reasoning in their respective theories of value. Only Marx, as I will show, had a consistent social and a consistently social labor theory of value. A theory taking its vantage point from the double character of the labor represented in the commodity. A theory that, in the concept of abstract labor as a specific social form of value, this theory gives coherence to both his critique of the classics as well as the analysis of the capitalist mode of production. 1.2.2 Conflicting conceptualizations of value in the Wealth of Nations, the 1776 version, right? Already in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, 1759, Smith was concerned with an objective measure of value more profound than the notion of utility, positioning himself against David Hume. Nevertheless, the new principle of value he determines as the machine or economy by means of which the harmonious movement of the system is produced, and therefore the concept of productive activity, is derived from a strong subjectivist-ethical criterion, namely approbation. Yet Smith was the first to move economic theory away from a use-value-centered standpoint to a theory linking productive activity with value. In The Wealth of Nations, 1776, Smith undertakes three considerable modifications of its earlier subjectivist ethical qualification as labor as the sole standard for value. Next to a theory of the toil of labor, he holds a theory of relative prices, of which more below, from which follows a component parts theory of value. We've seen that before. Ricardo will later resort to considerable modifications as well, but in a different vein. To understand Ricardo's and Marx's critique of Smith, let us first look at the problems in Smith's conceptualizations, Earlier, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith draws a close relation between the value of a good or produce and the labor time necessary to produce it. Quote, this is Beavers again, right? I think. Yes. In that early and rude state of society which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them for one another. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. It is natural that what is usually the produce of 2 days or 2 hours' labor should be worth double of what is usually the produce of 1 day or 1 hour's labor. But this relation is only valid in an early and rude state of society, a pre-capitalist society. It was only before the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land that labor, measured in expenses, that is time, could meaningfully yield the standard of the proportions in which different objects could be exchanged for one another. But this is not the conceptualization of value Smith has in mind for the liberal bourgeois society he investigates. In it, the concept of value, and therefore the relation between labor and value, becomes dramatically different. Quote, every man is rich or poor to the degree in which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. But after the division of labor has once thoroughly taken place, it is but a very small part of these with which a man's own labor can supply him. The far greater part of it he must derive from the labor of other people, and he must be rich or poor according to the quantity of that labor which he can command or which he can afford to purchase. The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Close quote. In bourgeois society, the value of commodities is no longer measured in the labor expenses objectified in the commodities, but in labor commanded, in the quantity of labor which can purchase or command a commodity. Now, this is an entirely different thing than to say that the value of commodity consists in the labor that it costs. For now, it is the value of labor someone can command and not labor values that govern exchange relations. See, this is where labor power comes from, right? Marx sees Smith's tautology in the fact that Smith does not consistently follow the concept of the quantity of labor as the immanent measure of value in units of time contained in a commodity, and instead takes refuge in a concept of the value of labor, which already contains a value-determined quantity. So, kick the meaning down the road. As wage labor, that is, the labor power commodity, has value, but in consequence, it cannot itself determine value. The value, quote, the value of labor, or rather of labor capacity, changes like that of any other commodity and is in no way specifically different from the value of other commodities. Here, value is made the measuring rod and the basis for the explanation of value. So we have a cercle vicieux. As a general logical prerequisite, it's obvious that what accounts for an entity must be of a different category and quality than the entity itself. So, we have abstraction, right? In the view of Helmut Brentel, yet again, we are here confronted with the circle of reasoning and classical theories of value. But we will see that present-day Marxologists stick to the same illogical schema. Needless to say, for Marx, Smith's original conception of value as, quote-unquote, labor commanded, as equaling the value of labor, is not only tautological, but anachronistic. Smith's peculiar inversion of historical relations consists that, on the one hand, he assumes an objective theory of labor values in social relations, in which the conditions for production and reproduction have not yet been subsumed under objective exchange relations, that is, exchange relations governed by social labor as the sole measure of value. But as soon as he describes capitalist relations, ironically, this determination no longer holds. Under capitalist relations in which the produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. Therefore, Smith merely assumes production prices that must yield, i.e., substitute the profits of the stock which advanced the wages and furnished the materials of that labor invested by the owner of the stock. See, it's reductionist, right? Accordingly, we find here a further specification of the labor commanded theory of value. Quote, the real value of all the different component parts of price, it must be observed, is measured by the quantity of labor which they can, each of them, purchase or command. Labor measures the value, not only that part of price which resolves itself into labor, but of that which resolves itself into rent, and of that which resolves itself into profit. In every society, the price of every commodity finally resolves itself into some one or other or all of these three parts. And in every improved society, all three enter more or less as component parts into the price of the far greater part of commodities. Wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue, as well as of all exchangeable value. Now, the further specification is, again, tautological, because allegedly, under capitalist relations, an explanation of price based on labor value seems no longer possible. Smith holds the view that the price or exchangeable value of a commodity must be resolved into price constituents, measured by money, I guess, wages, profits, and rent. Again, we're confronted with a circular argument. The explanans is already contained in the explanandum. That is, price is explained by price. In both cases of circular reasoning, the theory of value is dissolved into a theory of relative price that already encompasses the market and presupposes a general rate of profit. It thereby resorts to the explanatory framework of the circulation sphere, yet another inconsistency with regard to the initial claim. In consequence, Smith's conceptualization of natural price, resolving into the price of labor, capital, and land, that is, wages, profit, and rent, has given the incentive to the Sayin, Sayin theory of the factors of production, that is, the Trinity formula in Marx's dictum, that no longer sees labor as the source of value. The necessary unity of the substance and the measure of value, which Marx's labor theory of value accounts for, remains altogether anathematic in Smith's theory. To the contrary, Smith abandons his initial determination of an immanent measure of value for an external measure of value in a theory of relative price. Accordingly, by abstaining from a reflection of inner coherence and sticking to the phenomenal form of price, Smith and Ricardo were unable to develop a theory of the value forms as the qualitative theory of the determination of money and price. Ricardo's improvement in value theory as against Smith's concept of value as labor commanded, or the value of labor, is obvious from the very line of his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation of 1817. Quote, the value of a commodity or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production and not on the greater or less compensation which is paid for that labor. Now, this seems closer, indeed, to Marx's later view, but other than Smith, whose main aporia gap is owed to an anachronistic view of capitalist society, the precariousness of Ricardo's theory is owed to missing conceptual differentiations resulting from a conflation of different levels of abstraction, which is sort of the whole point of this business. From the start, Ricardo identifies concrete and abstract labor. All labor for him is concrete labor. Labor and labor power, surplus and value and profit, and following from his inability to understand the specificities of value-creating labor in the production process, constant and variable capital. Instead, Ricardo merely differentiates between mixed and circulating capital, different forms arising out of the process of the circulation of capital. So there is a deflection. Remember, I discussed the difference between constant and variable and between fixed and circulating. They're not identical, and it can be problematized in that way, which effectively leads to Ricardo's failure to explain the emergence of a uniform rate of profit on the basis of his own value theory. The conflation of these terms can be deduced from Ricardo's incomprehension of, number one, the specificity of value and surplus value producing labor in the production process measured in a variable working day, i.e. in wages, which represent necessary labor as against surplus labor, and whose quantitative difference is the source of surplus value, and in deduced form, profit. Remember, the conflation of these terms can be deduced from Ricardo's incomprehension of, number one, the specificity of value, etc., and number two, in consequence, the unequal exchange between capital and labor. All in all, Marx's accusation of the lack of the power of abstraction weighs heavily or heavy on Ricardo's economic theory. This becomes obvious right at the beginning of Ricardo's analysis, where the rate of profit is smuggled in without a previous explanation of the basis of profit in the first place. It's one of many gaps in Ricardo, for it is entirely unclear how, from Ricardo's concept of value, depending on the relative quantity of labor from which is necessary for its production, we should come to profit at all. So, all Ricardo's illustrations only serve him as a means to smuggle in the presupposition of a general rate of profit. And this happens in the first chapter on value, while wages are supposed to be dealt with only in the fifth chapter and profits in the sixth. How from the mere determination of the value of the commodities, their surplus value, the profit, and even a general rate of profit are derived remains obscure with Ricardo. In fact, he's very Trumpian. In fact, the only thing which he proves in the above illustrations is that the prices of the commodities, insofar as they are determined by the general rate of profit, are entirely different from their values. And he arrives at this difference by postulating the rate of profit to be law. Let me break here for a second and remind you that there are juridical elements to this argument. Anyway, one can see that though Ricardo is accused of being too abstract, one would be justified in accusing him of the opposite. That is, lack of the power of abstraction, inability when dealing with the value of commodities to forget profits, a fact which confronts him as a result of competition. Remember how we've gone into, competition, and that's Anwar Sheikh's kind of issue at one point. The real problem, according to Marx, is that because Ricardo always confuses value and production prices, from the beginning of his inquiry, he never arrives at the analysis of value. His vantage point starts off too late, so to speak, by beginning with the superficial forms of appearance of value, that is, cost price, or, in Marx's terminology, production price, to investigate the effects of a rise or fall of wages on them. These effects are then naturally taken to explain the general rate of profit, but we are left with a non sequitur. Wage itself is wanting of an explanation. Without a concept of the wage form, his concept of profit is a deus ex machina. Noting, of course, that this will be a problem in the current state with artificial intelligence. This problem becomes eminent when Ricardo touches upon social reproduction. Here, he repeats Smith's tautological misconceptions to finally capitulate to the impasse, simultaneously determining the value of a commodity by the socially necessary labor time, the quantity of labor needed for its production, and the value of labor in exchange with capital. Now, let me break here for a second. All that seems right in a significant number of, Marxological texts. So it's not to negate that, but to say that, there is a logical progression. It's just not accurate. Ricardo's inability to grasp not labor, but labor power as a commodity, and therefore to grasp the function of the wage form, leads to another tautology. Quote, the power of the laborer to support himself and the family, which may be necessary to keep up the number of laborers, does not depend on the quantity of money which he may receive for wages, but on the quantity of, subsistence. That is, food, necessaries, and conveniences become essential to him from habit, that which that money will purchase. The natural price of labor, therefore, depends on the price of the food, necessaries, and conveniences required for the support of the laborer and his family. With a rise in the price of food and necessaries, the natural price of labor will rise. With the fall of that price, the natural price of labor will fall. Something you want to think about in the coming months. Because Ricardo fails to determine the value of labor by the money expression of wages based on the labor time socially necessary for its reproduction and therefore variable. The money expression of wages, but, fails to determine the value of labor by the money expression of wages, but by natural price, i.e. a fixed from habit level of wages warranting the reproduction of the worker and her family. Natural price, again, depends on the price of necessaries. The value of labor as labor's natural price, therefore, is determined by the use values necessary for the worker's subsistence, expressed in price of means of subsistence. Now, Ricardo completely disregards the constitutive function of that wage form, its unequal exchange with capital, which would require a value determination in terms of socially necessary labor time, i.e., value, not in terms of use value. Ultimately, the value of labor, an expression of price, is explained by price. We find the same circular reasoning that we have confronted in Smith's determination of value by labor commanded, or by the value of labor, which itself is wanting of an explanation. Because both authors do not comprehend the necessity of a concept of the substance of value in which both the quality and the quantity of that value is grounded, a concept of absolute value, ultimately, which first of all explains relative values. They could not escape the tautological character of the explanatory framework. What is more, in their explanatory framework, they remain on the level of appearance of production price and therefore resort to the sphere of circulation. But let us briefly return to Smith in order to see more precisely why Ricardo theoretically lagged behind Smith himself. As we've seen from the fact that in capitalist production, the worker can no longer buy back her own product, Smith draws the conclusion that the exchange value of the commodities under capitalist relations is no longer determined by the quantity of labor, but by its value. For Smith, the difference between the quantum of labor that a commodity costs and the quantum of commodities which the worker can buy with this labor is crucial. Now, but why did Smith resort to such a modification? Marx correctly sees that Smith goes positively mad over the problem of the exchange between capital labor and labor on the basis of the formal validity of equivalent exchange, as einformlich irremacht. Something else besides an exchange of equivalents, the exchange of labor with its products, seems to be happening. Now, Smith senses that, although he cannot account for the reasons why, the law of value is transformed into a law of appropriation. Now, it is this very circumstance, this confrontation with a structural antinomy, how the exchange between capital and labor can be explained on the basis of the exchange of equivalents, that induced Smith to modify his initial value theory from a theory of materialized labor towards a theory of labor commanded that is itself wanting of an explanation and caught up in circular reasoning. But whereas Smith feels some flaw has emerged and senses that somehow, whatever the cause may be, and he does not grasp what it is, in the actual result, the law is suspended. More labor is exchanged for less labor from the labor's standpoint. Less labor is exchanged for more labor from the capitalist standpoint, so that the law of value changes into its opposite. Now, Ricardo does not even suspect that this presents a problem at all. Ricardo simply answers that, quote, Ricardo simply answers that this is how matters are in capitalist production. Not only does he fail to solve the problem, he does not even realize its existence in Adam Smith's work. Ricardo is satisfied with demonstrating that the changing value of labor and short wages does not invalidate the determination of the values of the commodities, which are distinct from labor itself by the relative quantity of labor contained in them. They're not equal, that is, the quantity of labor bestowed on a commodity and the quantity of labor which that commodity would purchase. He contents himself with stating this fact. Now, but how does the commodity labor differ from other commodities? One is living labor, and the other objectified labor. They are, therefore, only two different forms of labor. Since the difference is only a matter of form, why should a law apply to one and not the other? Now, Ricardo doesn't answer. He does not even raise the question. The identification of the value of labor with the labor product on the one hand, that is, i.e., the conflation of labor and labor power, as well as that of cost price and relative value, in Ricardo lead to considerable problems. These problems directly affect the emergence of a general rate of profit that Ricardo initially presupposes but cannot explain. While from Smith's theory of production costs or value component theory that Ricardo initially rejects, it follows that the rise in one of the value components, that is labor, leads to a rise in all the components, which fatally contradicts the equal parts of value assumption of that theory. Ricardo was set to prove that under circumstances, i.e., when the proportion of fixed capital employed was relatively high, tech, for example, machinery, a rise in wages affects a lowering of commodity prices. Now, in the principles of political economy and taxation, therefore, Ricardo therefore introduces another modification to his initial labor theory of relative value. No longer is the amount of labor materialized in the commodity exclusively decisive for its value, but also the composition of fixed and circulating capital, and therefore the quantity of time that goes into the production and the circulation process. Initially assuming that neither the level of wages nor that of profit, but only the quantity of labor bestowed on them affects the relative value of commodities. In section 4 of his main work, he modifies his initial claim. Quote, the principle that the quantity of labor bestowed on the production of commodities regulates their relative value is considerably modified by the employment of machinery and other fixed and durable capital. Were it the case that men employed fixed capital of the same value and of the same durability, then the value of the commodities produced would be the same, and they would vary with greater or less quantity of labor employed on their production. However, supposing that two different capitalists employed different proportions of machinery, that is fixed capital, in their production, the ones using a greater proportion of fixed capital, i.e. manufacturers, would have to obtain a further sum for the profit which they have invested in machinery, and consequently their goods must sell for a higher price than, say, the produce of the farmers. Supposing then that a rise in wages squeezes, remember, profit squeezes, right? Remember then that a rise in wages squeezes the rate of profit from 10 to 9%, the product of manufactured goods with a higher organic composition of capital would yield a smaller rate of profit. It would fall relatively to corn or to any other goods in which a less proportion of fixed capital entered. The degree of alteration in the relative value of goods on account of a rise or fall of labor would depend on the proportion which the fixed capital bore to the whole capital employed. The higher the proportion of fixed and durable capital, the lower its relative value. Regarding the fact that also the time necessary to bring the commodities to the market, the time of production, as well as the turnover time affects the relative value of a commodity, it follows that not only the quantity of labor bestowed determines the relative value of a commodity, but also the composition of capital and the time within production and circulation, factors independent of the actual labor needed to produce the commodity. We can therefore conclude that Ricardo's basic methodological predicament, namely the conflation of different levels of abstraction, accounts for Ricardo's modified and for Marx, hence inconsequential labor theory of value. In sum, Marx's main points of criticism directed against Ricardo are, number one, an insufficient categorical determination of specifically value-creating and value-determining labor. Number two, that instead of a differentiation of capital into variable and constant capital, Ricardo merely considers the effects of rises in the value of labor with regard to the secondary differentiation in fixed and circulating capital. So in that one sense, we see the kind of elision that occurs when I was previously describing the difference between fixed and circulating capital and variable and constant capital, or constant and variable capital. While for Marx, all of the phenomena Ricardo describes can be traced back to a consistent ground in the specific social form of labor, the basis of which both explains different individual rates of profit, as well as the emergence of a general rate of profit as a transformed and hence already mystified and fetishized form of surplus value. So, we're seeing a move in generalization. Anyway, Ricardo takes refuge in the assumption of the necessity of modifications already in the basic theory of value, owed to the missing conceptual distinctions or abstractions between value and cost price, and ultimately price of production and relative value, delegating the existence of value/price to the sphere of exchange market, that is the market, and not to the sphere of production. This is the entire crux of, little battles within Marxology about where is value and price relative to production and to distribution. So Ricardo, therefore, like Smith before, and falls in consequentially explaining the existence of a social coherence in labor-based value. With the previous discussion, we could see not only the aporia, the gaps, in Smith's and Ricardo's theories of value, and their ultimate inability to explain the exchange of capital and labor on the basis of the formal validity of equivalent exchange. We could also see that is reconstructing Marx's imminent critique of both positions, in what respect Marx was eager to distinguish his own value theory from theirs. I think this is his own value theory from theirs, in a concept of the substance of value in abstract homogeneous, that is, value producing labor measured in socially necessary labor time as the unity of both quality and quantity of value, and therefore an intrinsic measure to the superficial and fetishized forms of value, that is, natural price, relative value, etc., that Smith and Ricardo ultimately resorted to. It is therefore no less than absurd to claim that Marx's labor theory of value was a classical residue. It was precisely the critical tool of disclosure of the aporia in the classical conceptions of value. Now, that may or may not, sort of nip it in the bud, but we'll see. Section 1.3, the critical function of Marx's labor theory of value against some readings of quote-unquote form in contemporary value form theory. You can see that we began our little fussing around with various questions about the value form. We tried to see it from a certain author's definitional points of view. We sort of concluded, I would hope, that there are levels of abstraction that are engaged in this peculiar little process, and that they can be articulated, they can be differentiated, Marx's from Smith and Ricardo. So 1.3. Authors of the Marxian tradition critically dealing with Marx's labor theory of value have not only disregarded the break with the classical conception of value that constituted Marx's critique of political economy in the first place, they have also been oblivious to the specific critical function of the differentiation between abstract and concrete labor. See, often the argument breaks down to that distinction, and the succeeding value form analysis conducted in the first chapter of Capital, namely as being a critique of the fetishism of simple circulation and its semblance, and hence their incomprehension of the specificity of money. The thing leaps, quickly. This is that front-loading question, remember? As a consequence, they do not just misunderstand the specific use of crucial terms like value form or value form, but fail to recognize Marx's method as an evolving critique of the fetishistic categories of classical political economy, a method which must start from the assumption of the totality of the social form of labor that provides the coherence and obfuscated ground of the value forms of money, capital, etc. This chapter will critically deal with the criticisms of Marx's method and the offered alternative assumptions, namely, number one, the methodological preference of value form over the substance of value as guiding principle. Number two, the hypostasis of simple circulation, that is, exchange or the market, as the foremost feature of the capital relation and the locus of value constitution. And number three, the call for the necessity of an unmediated or presuppositionless, remember we were talking about presupposition before, beginning of the exposition. Now, for reasons of space, we treat only briefly arguments which to discuss and refute in detail, which would require a much longer chapter. So I'm going to stop here. We have 10 more pages to go. We will obviously be able to get rid of those in our next reading of this, which I will resume on Monday in August. we will begin at 1.3.1. So we managed to get from 1.2 to 1.3.1. And there's a lot here. So we're not really done with this yet. There's a lot of other summaries and conclusions that are necessary from this chapter. So we've been looking at situating the critique of the fetishism and the bourgeois relations of production back into the critique of political economy. A book, the first chapter of a book, Value Without Fetish, Uno Cuso's Theory of Pure Capitalism in Light of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, by Elena Louisa Long. And she has a certain style of argument, which is, I think, a really interesting one. And she has a newer book in 2022 that talks about complaints about sort of an oppositional or a dialectical treatment of certain Marxian viewpoints, and that's her newer book, which we may look at some moment. And she's also a very interesting person. It would be interesting to listen to her rock group, for example. So that's another story, but a story best treated elsewhere. So I will stop